Doc, we've studied the resurrection of Jesus quite a long time. You a lot longer than me. I've been looking at it since, I don't know, seriously, I've been looking at it since at least 1998. Actually, before 1998, but I mean, really getting into it then.
That's getting close to 30 years.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, so, and you've been doing a lot longer than me. You've been doing it for about 60 years, right?
Yeah, and I don't mind feeling really old because I'm feeling old for the kingdom.
So, yeah, the resurrection, studying the resurrection of Jesus, apologetics in general, but especially the resurrection, has some really good benefits to it, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. Why don't you, what are some that you can think of right off? Give me one.
Well, in my life, most relevantly, resurrection solved my doubt. Solved my factual doubt. Now, later, I had to learn to deal with my emotions because my doubt morphed into emotional doubt. But most directly, it solved my doubt. So I could say studying the resurrection was my entree into Christian teaching for these basically 50 years.
You know, it helped my doubts as well. I remember, you know, you call it the famous Baltimore call, right?
The famous Baltimore call. And in your most recent book, you tell the story by that name.
Yep. Well, that's what you've been calling it all these years. So it was 1988 or 89. I think it was 89.
I remember it well.
I remember calling you from, my wife and I were living with my parents at that time. We were fairly newlywed. And I remember calling you from the attic where we had my parents had a finished attic, and that's where Debbie and I were staying. And yeah, I remember just calling you and saying, Doc, you know, I'm out sharing my faith and these people are raising objections and I don't know how to answer it. And it's like, look, you know, what about all the, you know, a lot of scholars don't think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels. And if they didn't know who wrote them, well, then how can we know we can trust those Gospels? And this is really rocking my faith. And you said?
And I said, pretty shortly, I said, Mike, was Jesus Christ raised from the dead?
And I said, well, yeah.
Yeah, like, how is that relevant?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, okay, Mike, then if Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, isn't that the answer to your questions? And
how's that the answer to my question?
So we explained it a little bit. We said, see, even today, Mike, we should maybe tell people, we go on today as the upshot of that conversation, and we say to people asking questions, even if there's errors here or there, and I tell people, you know where I teach, and you know what statement of faith I sign, but if I can't explain everything in the Bible, that doesn't mean I don't have data for the resurrection. And I still believe there's strong data for the gospel, i.e., the deity, death, and resurrection of Christ, the gospel data, and the need for faith. So that's how it started back then. And I said, well, are you sure about those things? Deity, death, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so...
Yeah. And I said, well, yeah,
what was the answer? Yes, but...
Yeah, if the deity and resurrection of Jesus are correct, then Christianity is true. But what about the contradictions that we cite? And you said?
Yeah, and I said, Mike, well, I explained the minimal facts to you. It's a minimal fact argument. I can do it if you want, but the minimal fact argument. And basically my point was, if this minimal number of facts, and both of us have used anywhere from like 3 to 6 facts, and if those are true by the data, then don't come back at me with questions where we may not know the answer or where we do, but the data it's a pretty tough question. Let's concentrate on what we know. Yeah. Because here it is in a nutshell. If what we know establishes the truth of Christianity and eternal life, well, as I tell my grad students, ask Paul about this verse. Ask Moses about this verse. Ask Jesus about this verse. But don't ask about your faith, because if the gospel's true and you're on the way to heaven, hey, just take it seriously and calm down a little bit and take your time answering the other questions.
Yeah, it's like every time you were just saying, look, did Jesus rise from the dead?
Over and over that night.
Yeah, it's like, all right, I get it. If Jesus rose, Christianity's true. Even if Matthew,
There,
Mark, Luke, and John didn't write, even if there are errors in the Gospels, even if there was
if
some
there's
genocide.
problems I can't explain.
Yeah, yeah. So, I
And
mean, that really,
but what happened at the very end of the phone call? I mean, you wrote it in the book.
yeah, it's like,
We
that's
were,
a game changer for me
but
because I understood that if Jesus rose, it's game, set, match.
I love that phrase that you
Christianity's
used.
true, period. And I might struggle with some of these other things, but they
Sure.
are secondary and tertiary issues.
But at the end of the phone call, when you were pretty well satisfied, I was like hanging up, and I said, "All right, Mike. Well, glad we're set." And you go, "One more question." You remember what you asked?
I don't.
It's in your book. You said, "What about Joshua and the people of Israel?" Which is a very tough question. And I said, "Mike, did Jesus rise from the dead?" Because to this day, that is a very tough question with Joshua. But if I'm sure of the deity, death, resurrection, a very good verse is Romans 10:9, and it's an early creedal verse, probably from the 30s. But if you believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you're saved. And that's it. So even when you came back with this tough one, which is a tough one for me, I'm saying that's fine for a tough one, but doesn't disprove the gospel faith.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I'm with you that it helps with doubts. It really has helped me with doubts.
Factual
Now,
doubts.
yeah, factual doubts. Now I have to tell you, there are times when I still doubt. You said in our previous discussion that you don't doubt anymore.
No.
I still have some experiences of doubts, and I'm not finding that they're intellectual in nature, though. The way I like to, I came to this realization, I don't know, about 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. But you and I, sometimes we speak on large stages at conferences, big churches. And the media people, the AV people, they will put tape on the stage that glows. And they'll say, don't walk to the
Yes.
other side of this tape,
Yes.
front or back. Don't go in front of it, behind this, and because the lighting won't show on you,
And we
right?
can't pick you up on the cameras.
That's right. So it's like, all right, I can make my way real easily back and forth. Maybe there's 30 feet on stage I can move. And I like to walk around on stage when I'm speaking.
So do I.
So it's like, I could do cartwheels. Well, I used to be able to do them. I don't know that I can still do them. But I could walk back and forth. You could blindfold me, and I could walk back and forth, jog from one side to the other,
Right.
and never go outside of those boundaries. But if you took a plank that size, maybe 10 feet, like from the front to back, 20 feet from the front to back, and as long as it would take to suspend that 500 feet above the ground between two skyscrapers and say, all right, I want you to walk from one skyscraper to the next, but it's 500 feet above the ground, I'm not doing it. And it's not that I can't do it. I know that I could do it, but I think, what if? What if what? What if I fall? Yeah, but you're not going to fall. You got plenty of room here. You could do it jogging back and forth. You could do it blindfold. I know, but what if I fall?
And then you add the bad words, and that would be horrible. I might die or something. So we hype it up.
So, I look at that and say, all right, I look at the evidence for the existence of God, the resurrection of Jesus. I don't have all the answers, but I think I've got enough answers to satisfy me to think that Christianity is true. But what plagues me are that what if. It's that what if I'm wrong that in the middle of the night, causes me to...
And that's the push from factual to emotional.
To emotional, yeah.
Hey, one point before we end that discussion. This is just a really touchy thing to me. It was a Friday night for that phone call, the Baltimore call. I was sitting on my porch, and that's the exact same porch in the exact same place that I had my make-believe conversation with God with my wife dying upstairs, and she died a few months later, and I was asking the Lord the tough questions of why is this happening to her. So on that same porch, with the baby monitor next to me to see if she coughed or did anything, and I ran upstairs. Two very important events to me on the same And it's believers helping believers, which is another message in itself. We need to be there for each other. But anyway.
You know, one of our board members, her mom just died like a week or two ago. I think a little more than a week ago. And then I have a dear friend whose husband just died about a little over a month ago. And another one of my board members, his dad died a year ago. And, you know, I was able to say some encouraging words to them.
Yes.
Things that really encouraged me when both my mom died and then my dad died a year later. It's like, wow, you know, I love them both. But I grieved their death, but I knew that I was going to see them again. In the relatively near future, I was going to see them again. Now, what really hurt was about 6.5 years ago, our beloved dog died that we had for 16.5 years. And we loved that dog. And it was the most heartbreaking day of my life, I think. You say, well, how can that be? You know, you grieved more over the death of your dog than your parents? Yes. Why? Well, because Jesus guarantees that because my parents were followers of him and I'm a follower of Jesus, that I'm going to see them again, that our life does not stop at the grave. It continues, eternal life with Christ in heaven. And but I don't have that kind of promise from Jesus regarding my dog. And to think that that dog may have taken its last breath and I'd never see it again. It just ceases to exist forever.
C.S. Lewis thought maybe.
Ooh. I know, and that's
Maybe.
encouraging. I know Bill Craig thinks that
Does he?
our pets can be in heaven. Dogs, yes. Cats, no. But no, they're cat people, so they think cats are going to be in heaven. But
Hey, by the way, Paul, before we go, Paul's verse in 1 Thessalonians, we do grieve, but not as those without hope. That's
right.
exactly the expression of you and your parents.
That's right.
We grieve, but not as those without hope. Because it says in the context, Jesus was raised, and that's the answer. So we can teach the same thing from the Apostle Paul on. And by the way, the whole topic of this conversation is how do we move from apologetics to ministry? And we're discussing grief, suffering, and how do you preach that first sermon with the casket in front of you? If you're a pastor, how do you do that? And do you dare tell these grieving people, let me talk about the resurrection, and you're afraid somebody might spit in your face and say, I'm hurting right now. You know, like you imagine all these things. But those are 3 ways the resurrection is applied to everyday life, which is what we're doing here. I think those are wonderful stories.
You know, well, thanks. I've had 2 other close friends die within the last few years. One, his name was Dewey, and you know, we were really close. He was in his 80s, and he died. And his wife Sissy asked me to speak at his celebration service, and it was cool. You know, he did not fear death. He wasn't hesitant about dying at all because he had the confidence that he had
wonderful.
Eternal life. And then the other, her name was Mary. She and her sister and 2 brothers grew up just 2 houses down from us. I mean, you know, we're talking in Baltimore County. They were 30 feet from us, you know, in our row homes, and they were, you know, she died.
How about Nabil?
Yeah, Nabil. Yep. Well, I didn't speak at his thing.
No, but you still went through some.
But Mary, I was asked her brother Rich that I grew up with. He was a good friend. He asked me to speak at her celebration service, and she wanted it to be evangelistic, and so I spoke at that. But what a difference it is when you know that the person in the casket, or the person, if it's a celebration service, they're already in the ground or cremated or whatever, that you know that they're with the Lord. It makes all the difference in the world, doesn't it? I just wish I could have had that same comfort about my dog, but the fact that I didn't showed that what a blessing it is. I mean, what a blessing it is to have that hope. Because if we didn't have that hope, if it was like the dog, if I were an atheist and I didn't have, I mean, that's not why you become a Christian, because you believe it's true. But one of the benefits is that hope.
Yeah, the resurrection requires, it's the step. I'll tell you this, of all the areas in the New Testament to which the resurrection is applied, our topic for today, the fact that believers will be raised like Jesus is the one that's mentioned the most times. If I remember correctly, 19 times it said we will be raised like Jesus. I mean, Philippians 3, 20, 21. He will raise our vile body to be like unto his glorious body. So the fact that the number one thing, Jesus, because I live, you shall live also, our Lord says. This promise is there for us when we're in our deathbed, when we're in the hospital room. And right now, a member of my family is young, too young, and suffering grievously right now. And I'm sitting here miles away going, so the application is for all of us. How do I grow? How do they grow? I hope they make it. They've got eternal, So the resurrection is applicable in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I'm it's like I don't fear death. I mean, nobody wants to think about how they're going to die.
A lot of pain.
Pain, discomfort. Are you going to deal with a painful bout of cancer over several years and getting chemo and all that? Or, we don't, or something that's going to just be really difficult death. We don't want that. But I mean, aside from that the moment of transition, I mean, I'm ready. I'm fine.
And Paul, who, when he said in Philippians 1, what he describes in Scripture could be a near-death experience. Whatever he said, 2 Corinthians 12, absent from the body, present with the body, I know not which, but he still says, dying, I prefer it because it's better.
Yep.
And then he says the final state after that, where you're re-embodied, is better by far. And those are hopes, and that's what we hear from people.
He's in prison. Philippians 1, he says, I'm hard-pressed between the two. I have the desire to die and be with Christ, for that is a whole lot better. Yet to remain on in the body is more necessary for your sake. And he was fine with that. But it's like, he says, verse 21? For to me,
that's
to
correct.
live is Christ and to die is gain. You know what's interesting in the Greek there's no verb. So it's a rhetorical device called ellipsis. So you have, it literally reads, to me, life, Christ, death, gain.
That's
it's
cool.
So close. You don't even have to have the verb there. It's like life is, for me, it's just living for Christ, pleasing Christ. Everything about that. And death is gain. It's like, go ahead and kill me. He's in prison at the time. Go ahead and kill me. I don't care. I win either way. I've heard you say that in your thing. If I die, if I live, I get to serve Christ. If I die, I get to be with him. It's a win-win.
Yeah, there was a Christian hymn years ago speaking as if it were speaking for Jesus, popular hymn, and he said, Jesus is talking, go ahead, drive the nails in my hand, for I will rise again. Death can't keep me in the ground. And there it is in the words of Jesus. So, and Jesus says things like that. So, And we're talking about death and dying, but there are a lot of other benefits too.
Yeah.
Resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, is linked to ethics, the fact of ethics. The last verse in 1 Corinthians 15 applies the resurrection to giving sacrificially, because there's no chapter division there. And you go right into chapter 16, verse 1, and Paul says, so the resurrection is true. Don't waste it. Be out there working. Oh, and by the way, take up an offering for the poor saints. So he moves into if Christ is raised, Christianity is true. If Christianity is true, are you helping those people out who are suffering? Are you contributing to it? So there's two in one chapter, 15, ethics and get your paycheck, get your wallets out. So
that last night we had dinner with Bill Smith and Stuart McAllister because Bill had invited you to speak to his C.S. Lewis group. And two great men. And Stuart was telling us how 4 occasions he was imprisoned for smuggling Bibles into a communist country. Let's see, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia,
Poland.
no, Russia, and East Germany.
I thought Poland. Okay.
Well, maybe Poland. All right. I just thought it was those. Maybe I'm wrong. But it was the Yugoslavia. Oh, no, Czechoslovakia that he had.
Was the worst,
It was
you
the
said.
worst. And I said, were you afraid in any of those circumstances? And Stuart just really, I mean, the guy's a hero to me. Anyone who does something like that and gets thrown in prison for his faith, that person's a hero. Anybody who is persecuted for their faith, that person is and they stand strong in their faith, that person's a hero, an example to me. And I said, Stuart, weren't you afraid at all? And he said, no, because, I give my life to Christ and it's whatever he has for me. I know I want to serve him. And
I know it's true.
I know it's true. And if they put me in prison, it's because he's got a role for me in prison. He wants for me to do something in there. He's got work for me to do in there. So whatever it is, and he talked about when he was in Russia. Remember, he said something to the guard that was going all through his car and everything, and kind of rebuked him, and said something like, go ahead, you can arrest me, you can beat me, you can do what you want. The more you beat me, the more rewards in heaven I get, or something. You ought to be ashamed of yourself for doing this. You're working against the Lord, against God. And the guard just kind of looked down. Like,
There's another fella who was put in prison behind the Iron Curtain besides Stuart, a good guy. And this guy said, he actually said to the guards in this communist nation, he actually said to them, hey, if you're going to beat me, that's not the end of the road. That's rewards for me. But if you do beat me to the point of which I die, do you know something? You're sending me to heaven. Do you really want to do that? You're sending me to heaven. And they didn't beat him up.
Okay.
Because he said, you're sending me to heaven.
So I got confused then. So I heard that story from you, not from Stuart. I'm conflating that, confusing that.
All three of us were there talking, though.
Yeah, it was cool, though. But Stuart had some good stories.
He
like
does.
when he was in Czechoslovakia.
Anybody who's been over there and done that stuff, you're right. You respect him big time.
Yeah. So I guess knowing Jesus rose from the dead when you're going through something like that. And who knows, within years, we might be experiencing persecution here in the U.S., and Europe is probably a lot closer to that right now than we are for being persecuted for your faith, some places in Europe. But if that ever happens, I want to have the assurance that Christianity is true.
Can you think of any other truth that you'd rather have, so to speak, keep in your back pocket, in your heart? Is there anything you'd rather have in tough situations like that?
Well, yeah, probably if Jesus appeared to me in person and said, you know what I mean? But aside from that, I'd say no. If I had to choose between evidence for the resurrection and evidence for the virgin birth,
Or any other miracle.
or any other miracle, Jesus, resurrection wins any day.
And that's the way it's used in the New Testament.
Yep.
Over
And that's the
over.
one we got the most evidence for, too. It's
Oh,
really awesome.
sure.
More than any
Sure.
other miracle.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, and we've already mentioned it, but I'll just say it again. One of my very favorite verses of all verses are Philippians 1, 21 and 23, where Paul says, because of the resurrection, I'll do it here, and if I don't, I'll do it there. Either way, I'm going to a far better place. So if he leaves me, I'm willing to preach even if I'm suffering. If he takes me, guess what? I'm home again. And I remember Billy Graham. They in an interview he did years ago, they said, "Are you afraid to die?" And Billy Graham said, "Oh, no, no." And they said, "Why?" And this was his reason. "I have tried so hard in my life to make sure I don't stumble and bring shame to the name of Christ. I know that if I die, that battle's over.
Good point.
I've fought the fight. And I'm taken. And wow, I don't have to live with that kind of thing over my head of disgracing his name. That's a whole nother perspective on this.
Yeah,
It's
that's
neat.
good.
We've had some great people through the years. D.L. Moody's got some great one-liners like this. We can learn from people who've been there and been through it and who leave us these testimonies. I love this topic.
There's something too. Let's say you're a college student. For those of you who may be college students, if Christianity's true, well, and if you are a follower of Jesus, well, then you have the privilege of being part of God's kingdom, of the family of God, and praying, and He will hear your prayers. And I know that for years, when I got to college, I had two objectives: get a good education and find a good wife. And it wasn't necessarily in that order in terms of my priorities, And I prayed every day and asking the Lord to give me a good wife, which He did. I fasted often. I mean, I was really serious about this. And so, we have these desires in our heart for our life, God's guidance in our life. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be good. Jesus promises persecution and hard times. He's not there to keep us from hard times. He'll be with us through it. But I would say that if you are a young person, a college student, something like along that line, young single adult, and you want a spouse, it's not guaranteed, because God is going to call some people to be single, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 7. But that's not the majority of people. And so I would say pray. And if Jesus rose from the dead, God will hear your prayers. And it can bring good benefits to your life. Would you agree?
Yeah, in both of our cases, well, I tell people, I know how this sounds, but I tell people, the Lord blessed me with two good wives, not at the same time, but two good wives. And I say that in presence of my present wife, and it doesn't bother her a bit. Because, I'm complimenting her too.
Pretty awesome.
But to get it right twice, I'm thinking, I literally say, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. Somebody got sent into my life twice. And although one was taken by death, her sister used to say to her when she was dying of cancer, she'd say to her little sister, she'd say, the Lord is going to heal you. And my first thought was, don't promise her that, because if she doesn't, but her sister continued, He's either going to heal you now or He'll heal you then. Either way, the prayer will be answered. Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in that make-believe talk with God on the porch, I picture the Lord saying, I answered his prayer. They go, what do you mean you answered his prayer? He died the most heinous death anybody could die. And then the Lord said, but then Sunday came. So sometimes we're healed in heaven.
Yeah.
And what's Paul say? 2 Corinthians 4, the light and momentary suffering is nothing compared to the eternal life which is on the way. And he just got done talking about the resurrection when he said that. So I could sit here and have these kind of conversations, and I walk away from the interview and I think, wow, that just psyched me up. I know, I've heard it a couple hundred times, but I get psyched up every time I hear it.
That's awesome. Yeah, that is cool. Well, so the resurrection, studying the resurrection of Jesus, is not only great for, contending for the truth of the Christian faith. It has many benefits to understand the evidence for the resurrection. Spiritual benefits, emotional benefits. If Jesus rose, Christianity's true. But yeah, there's a lot of benefits. And I'm so glad you specialized in it and turned me on to the resurrection of Jesus.
We both came through our doubts all right. Mm-hmm. The Lord blessed. Got the women, got the wives. It's like, and we've been around loved ones when they died. Both my parents have died in the last few years. Mm-hmm. They weren't afraid in either case. But that's what the Christian faith is. I'm not saying it's all rosy. I'm not saying there's not tough questions. I still think about the Joshua passage sometime, but it's not going to upset my faith. And And we have that. And it's, what other faith system, philosophical, religious, what other system has do you check all the right boxes? And you go, now, what difference does it make in your life? I told you the other day, a friend of mine wrote a book published by Baker on 50 benefits of the resurrection. 50. And how they work out theologically, practically. And he's a pastor. So he's interested in practical benefits. We've got something here that goes way beyond apologetics.
That's cool. Well, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. I hope you all have enjoyed this and will benefit from it as well. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for being with us.
Hey folks, I'm Mike Licona. If you like this video, then please like and subscribe. And look, if you like content like this, then consider partnering with us. Go to our website, risenjesus.com/donate.